Welcome to our State of the Technology presentation on telephone CPR and bystander response. Joining us today to share his expertise and insights into these areas of technology and services is Chief Tom Bouthillet. Tom is the EMS Battalion Chief at Hilton Head Island Fire Department in South Carolina, leads the South Carolina Resuscitation Academy, and is the founder of the very widely acclaimed 12-lead ECG blog. Chief Bouthillet is actually about to make a career transition in which he'll be retiring from the fire service and taking on a role with the Resuscitation Quality Improvement Program, or RQI as it's more commonly known, a joint effort between Laerdal and the American Heart Association. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
So EMS leaders have a big responsibility in deciding how they're going to approach implementation of dispatcher-guided CPR and the many other elements of bystander response. Tom, what insights can you share about what buyers should be looking for with telephone CPR programs and the many options they have available?
Right, great question, Mick. And before we get started, I just need to say one thing, because no matter how we classify 911 telecommunicators, they are, in my opinion, public safety professionals. They have a very difficult job, and they are deserving of our respect. They're deserving of a living wage. They're deserving of work-life balance, and they deserve the appropriate training and tools that they need to do their jobs at the best of their ability. And across much of the United States, I don't think we've done a very good job taking care of our telecommunicators, and I don't think that EMS has done an adequate job sort of connecting with, collaborating with, and really building a team atmosphere with our 911 telecommunicators. When you think about it, they completely own the first 600 seconds of a cardiac arrest. So our chain of survival, the first 2.5 links, arguably the first 3 links in an aspirational world, belong to 911. And so this is really critical if we want to succeed. Most PSAPs in the United States are using some type of EMD software already. I think it's a different conversation. If they're not, there are some PSAPs that aren't doing any. Maybe they think of themselves as primarily law enforcement and they just occasionally dispatch an ambulance or something like that. There are centers like that, and then maybe that's a different conversation if they've never purchased any type of EMD software. But the way I like to think of it is love the one you're with. So if you are currently using a particular EMD program, rather than jettison it, I would say start with where you are and see what you can do to improve the system that you're already using and that you're already comfortable with. Because there's this intersection between your CAD program, your GIS mapping, and your EMD software running on top. It's complicated. So sure, of course, every once in a while we update our technology, and that's a valid conversation. But I would say, especially in the beginning phases, just tracking the AHA's TCPR performance benchmarks is such a challenge that is where you should focus, is on performance, and take it one step at a time. Start small, make it achievable, and sometimes that just starts with a phone call or a relationship being built between an EMS chief and a 911 comms manager.
No, very valid points. And even the term EMD, emergency medical dispatcher, I think that should be more clearly recognized as a legitimate title of not only a public safety professional, but a healthcare professional, because they are providing healthcare through that telephone CPR link. And I think sometimes that point is missed on people as well.
100%. You're absolutely right about that.
You know, there's a number of options out there for the particular program that you choose to use. So what sort of things might people, want to consider?
Well, I think how engaged the medical control physician is and how much input they want into protocols and things like that plays a factor. There may be a PSAP that really wants everything to be very protocolized in a highly structured manner. And that's not just for our medical calls, that could be a fuel leak or something like that. And certain EMD packages, not just EMD, but just certain dispatch software. It's not always clear what the emergency is when the phone call first comes in, and so those decision points to determine what protocol you're in, what questions to ask, what pre-arrival instructions need to be given. It really depends on who your telecommunicators are. If they're all retired paramedics, that's one thing. If they are 100% were hired and just trained to be telecommunicators and they may not have as strong a medical acumen, then maybe those protocols will be more important. So I don't think there's any one dispatcher program that is all things to all people. I think it's going to really depend on how engaged the medical direction is, how well trained and how well supported the telecommunicators are, and whether or not you dispatch law enforcement, fire, and EMS, or just fire and EMS. You have to look at all of it. I think there is a bias in the United States to where law enforcement is kind of rules the roost when it comes to 911, and sort of giving equal time to EMS is sometimes a new conversation for those folks. And in those cases, I would just say, no matter what software you use, think in terms not just of compliance, but performance. In a perfect world, if you were compliant, it would imply performance. Like, well, I was 100% compliance, therefore we must be performing well. You would like to think that there's a symmetry between those two things, but that's not always the case. It turns out you can be compliant, but miss the boat. And so we need to be compliant with our program, but we should also, in parallel with that, track our actual performance, meaning our outcomes. Did we get it correct? Did we correctly identify that it was a cardiac arrest? How many seconds into the phone call did we start to provide CPR instructions? Did we over-verify breathing? Did we ask unnecessary questions? Did we adequately overcome objections to performing CPR? Those are all things that we should look at. These are high-level skills. These are things that require someone to actually listen to the 911 call and give objective, supportive, non-punitive feedback so that we can be our best. And I think when that happens, that is when our telecommunicators really become truly part of the team, and we can celebrate their performance as much as we celebrate a paramedic's performance when we have a cardiac arrest save.
Absolutely. And, I think you bring up valid points about how the background of the dispatchers and the variabilities in that could, drive some of your decisions about how structured you want those software programs to be. So very valid points. But let's consider the other facet of this, not just the emergency medical dispatch pre-arrival instructions component, but how about some of the options that are in the marketplace now for triggering bystander response to mobilize first responders and ideally get an AED on the scene? Any thoughts about what people should be considering with those sorts of tools?
I think these products are very promising. I think they're fascinating, and I think they are not only the present, but they are the future, because as we learn more about them and as we gain more experience with sort of like smartphone alerts to either off-duty firefighters or just lay CPR rescuers out in the community, you start to bump into the limits of those technologies. If you have a street address that accounts for an entire building complex, and there are multiple floors and things like that, the idea that an off-duty person necessarily is going to be able to find apartment 3216, that I have my doubts about that. However, the loss prevention officer that knows that property like the back of their hand, if that person has an AED and gets that alert, then we have much higher probability of getting hands on the chest and a shock prior to the ambulance arrival. So these are really interesting topics. I don't think we're done. We've done tremendous work. There's some promising technologies that are currently in use today. I'm very encouraged of what I see on the horizon. I think this is going to get better and better. But the thing to understand is the performance of these products is linked like this with telecommunicator performance, because if they don't successfully recognize in a timely manner that it's a cardiac arrest and do that rapid dispatch, there's going to be no push notification. There's going to be no alert. So if it takes 4 minutes into the call to decide it's actually a cardiac arrest and the ambulance is already halfway there, by the time we alert a bystander and they mobilize and arrive, the ambulance is going to be arriving on scene, and we will have lost that opportunity. So dispatcher performance and technology performance, they're one thing to me. And so it's really important that when we implement these technologies, we really, really support our telecommunicators at the same time.
The other point that really stands out to me, Tom, is what you're talking about with having the uh, community organized in a way that can take advantage of those push notifications, like having some sort of response inside a multi-story adult living complex, if you will, to mobilize people within that building or that neighborhood association, et cetera, to help put a finer point on refining that response and having them think through, when this thing goes off on my phone, what exactly are we going to do and who's going to do what? Thinking through, maybe someone gets the AED, someone goes to the house and starts chest compressions. All those, I think, are important conversations to have as well. So great points there. Um, how about the challenge of implementation? We talked a little bit about that, but are there some best practices associated with implementing uh, dispatcher guided CPR or telephone CPR, if you will, in managing that bystander response that they should be considering in their purchasing decision? Like, where do we put the AEDs and how do I identify them? Any thoughts about those aspects of this?
No, actually, I do not think there are true best practices on those types of things. I think those best practices are still emerging. As far as just telecommunicator CPR in general, yes, of course, there's a body of knowledge on that. The folks in Seattle, King County, Ben Bobrow and the work that he's done in Arizona and several other places around the country have done important work. So if you look at some of the core strategies of the Resuscitation Academy, once you've joined a cardiac arrest registry, a lot of things in dispatch. Number one is just, well, how quickly are you dispatching that first unit? How many call transfers are there before we get to the point where we're dispatching that first unit? So the 911 call to dispatch interval can be really prolonged in some communities, and that's an area where there can be significant improvement just with rapid dispatch and getting someone out the door. And then with telecommunicator CPR, no one calls 911 and says, we have a sudden cardiac arrest here. They say everything but. They say, I think my uncle is having a diabetic emergency, or someone fell and hit their head here, or hey, this guy is out, man, this guy just passed out, something like that. So the telecommunicator has a very difficult job just to figure out whether or not someone is in cardiac arrest. And if they're not confident, and how does one become confident, right? They get the education, the conceptual understanding from experts on the topic. Their concerns are taken seriously, and they're given legitimate answers. But if you think in your mind, my God, what if I'm wrong and we do CPR? I'm probably going to hurt this person, or I'll be embarrassed, and I don't want to be wrong. What will the guys out in the street think of me if I dispatch it this way in their CPR and it turns out to be post-ictal from a seizure? We have to do a better job explaining to our telecommunicators, this is what we want you to do. If someone suddenly collapses and there's a deviation from normal breathing, we want you to ramp up to CPR instructions quickly. Many times that will elucidate whether or not someone is truly in cardiac arrest, and it turns out to be kind of diagnostic. Person pushed my hands away. Fantastic. They're not in cardiac arrest. But don't be afraid of ramping up to those CPR instructions. That's what we want you to do. And by the way, EMTs and paramedics, if they just toned out 3 units to a cardiac arrest and then a minute later they say the patient's conscious talking, don't roll your eyes. Don't be like, dumb dispatchers, they didn't get it right. No, they're doing what they're supposed to do. Be professional. Thank them for reacting appropriately to the information they had in that moment. Turn around, go back to your fire station and watch Leave It to Beaver. It's no big deal. We don't want to underreact to a life-threatening, time-sensitive medical emergency. And so that's what I mean by giving that emotional support in addition to like our didactic support, our non-punitive feedback, so that our dispatchers feel supported when they make those decisions in the moment. We owe them that. And so that education is also for them, but it's also for our ground field crews to be like, hey, knock it off. They're doing what we've asked them to do, and they're doing a great job.
No, great points, Tom. Now, there's also some pitfalls, and you've kind of been touching on some of the pitfalls associated with all of this. But are there any other pitfalls that any of these tools may help mitigate, or that we need to be aware of? Kind of things related, perhaps, to as you mentioned, the identification of where the AEDs are in the community, for example. I mean, it's great if you have a bystander response program, but if we don't know where the AEDs are in the community, that's going to obviously limit our ability to get that AED on the scene. Any thoughts on things that communities can do to help map the locations of their AEDs?
Absolutely. This is a really important issue because we know from CARES data that AEDs are fairly abundant in the community, not just on Hilton Head, but around the United States. But in our country, they are rarely used. And anecdotally, our own experience is we've worked many cardiac arrests, some of whom have survived with full neurologic function, that were 100 yards from an AED, right down the boardwalk. And someone who should have known was present at the patient's side. So this sort of thing happens a lot. At a minimum, you should know where your AEDs are. And so we had an intern one summer, and one of his major functions was to find every AED on Hilton Head Island. We had placed about half of them, but we determined there were about 215 AEDs on the island, at least that we know about. And so we were able to program them into the smartphone app that we use to alert bystanders, and that helps us track them. But there are times that it could be locked up at night, or that somebody gets a new manager at some golf club and they don't want the liability, or they throw it in the trash can and decide not to replace it. It's always kind of like, it's always a work in progress. You're always trying to keep that data updated. If you know where they are, you can put them on a GIS map layer in your 911 call center, so at least they can see a little icon that lets them know, oh, there's an AED at this Starbucks. But will they have the presence of mind to know that if someone is having breakfast in the adjacent restaurant, that that's only 100 yards away? Hard to say, because they're not focused on this place, they're focused on that place. So it gets complicated, but there are some really promising technologies that I've had the privilege of previewing what's on the horizon. And we're going to have a new era soon of smart AEDs that know where they are and know that they are nearby a cardiac arrest patient, and those AEDs will alert bystanders. And so it's an exciting time. I expect in the next 5 years, we're going to see a super convergence of a lot of these technologies that are going to really improve the situational awareness of our 911 telecommunicators.
Great points, and that was a great segue to what's out on the horizon. So you've already covered that. Is there anything else that you think buyers of these types of programs or technologies should be aware of, or anything you want to reemphasize before we close?
I guess just to realize that like these are perfectly legitimate areas to spend money, and it never fails to boggle the mind that a fire department that will put $1 million tiller truck into the budget with a straight face will hem and haw over $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to make substantial improvements in their 911 call centers. That, I mean, think about it. You can train 500 people in the community in heart saver CPR, or you can train one dispatcher, because that person's going to be on the phone constantly with people in or a 911 caller that's dealing with a cardiac arrest, and their ability to make a team out of themselves and the 911 caller to get hands on that chest, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck right there. And so, our 911 call center, we use the RQIT product in Deschutes County and Bend, Oregon. Our friends at Bend Fire Department have a wonderful relationship with their PSAP, and they've just kind of done it homegrown. They're performing marvelously. So it can be done without a third party, but other people like Peter Antevi in South Florida can just walk into their PSAP and be like, hey, everybody, Peter Antevi, you guys have the hardest job in the world, here to support you, but can we have this conversation? And because everyone loves Peter Antevi, he can do that. I don't have that personality. So so I think the most important thing is just to have the relationship, start the relationship, approach them with respect. They are professionals. They have an extremely difficult job. So if we come at them with a little bit of humility and a little bit of respect, and explain to them what we're trying to accomplish and make them true partners in the process, I think that we're going to have good results, whether we use a product to do that or whether or not we give up our time to do that. It has to be one or the other. If you're not going to hire a third party to do it, then you're going to have to put in the time. And it is a labor of love, but it's going to take some time. But the relationships are key. And so I would just say, start there, pick up a phone and develop a relationship.
Great points, Tom. Thanks so much for taking some time to help us all better understand the things we should be taking into consideration when contemplating the purchase of telephone CPR and these different bystander response programs.